the sun is shining, and it feels like spring is coming soon. Welcome to this webinar on invasive species. I have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists today, and I'm also very lucky that I get to work with these two talented people every day. Lyndsey has been with the BTC for 6 years now and is the Landowner Steward Coordinator. Lyndsey worked with landowners to improve the ecological health of the trail by removing invasive species and planting native species in their place. Lyndsey has a background in restoration ecology, and in her off time can be found puttering around her garden and improving the biodiversity and habitat in her own backyard. So welcome, Lyndsey. And Mara joined the BTC as an ecologist in 2020, and she currently works to support the BTC's land stewardship program. Mara is a certified arborist and holds a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology and Conservation from the University of Guelph and a Master of Science in Biology from McMaster University. Mara's prior work experience includes conducting ecological research in a variety of ecosystems such as tallgrass prairie and boreal forest. Mara also delivers environmental education and community stewardship projects for local not-for-profit organizations. So we have some really talented BTC staff that we're really grateful to share their knowledge today. So over to you, Lyndsey and Mara, and thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for our invasive species webinar. So just to give you a sense of what you're in for today, we're going to start with some basics of what invasive species are and sort of their characteristics. And then we're going to talk about some invasive species that you might see along the Bruce Trail and along the Niagara Escarpment. As our title suggests, we're going to talk about some invasive plants, some invasive pests, and some invasive pathogens. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we do here at the BTC to manage invasive species and what you can do as well to help. So Lyndsey, I'll take the next slide. Perfect. So before we kind of get into talking about specific invasive species, I wanted to go over some of the terms that get thrown around a lot when we talk about this topic to make sure we're sort of all on the same page about what an invasive species is. And so you'll often hear terms like native species, non-native species, and invasive species. And so I wanted to take a minute to talk about what the difference is between these different terms. So a native species is a species that's existed in an area for a long time period and has evolved in that area. So it's evolved in the local environment, it's adapted to the soil and the weather conditions, and it's evolved in tandem with other species that are also found in that area. So it tends to have all these different relationships and interactions with the other species that is evolved along with. And so that's why native plant species, for example, tend to have a lot of native pollinators that rely on them because they've been evolving together for a long period of time. In contrast, a non-native species is a species that's been introduced to an area outside of its native range, so it hasn't evolved there over a long time period, and it's often been introduced by humans, either intentionally or by accident. And then an invasive species is a non-native species whose introduction is causing harm to the environment or to human health or the economy. And the invasive species that we're going to be talking about today are particularly detrimental to our native biodiversity and our native environment. So you can see that not all non-native species are necessarily invasive and causing detrimental impacts, but some certainly are, and those are the ones we're going to focus on today. So I'll take the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what makes an invasive species invasive. There are certain characteristics of invasive species that allow them to sort of come in and really take over an area and dominate over a native species, which is what causes this detrimental impact. So on the top left, you can see here that invasive species tend to outcompete native species for food and habitat. They're able to kind of come in and replace native species in our environment, and therefore they reduce the local biodiversity of the area. And the way that they're able to do that is that often invasive species are very adaptable and they thrive in disturbed environments. So they're not picky about their habitats. They can survive in a lot of different conditions, and so they're often able to take advantage of disturbances maybe that are caused by humans and sort of come in and get established. Also, because they're outside of their native range, they often have few predators in their new environments because predators tend to evolve to take advantage of the prey that's right around them. So when invasive species are moved out of their native environment, they no longer have those predators keeping their populations in check. And so they're able to sort of expand quite rapidly. And then the final point is that many invasive species reproduce quite quickly. So many invasive plants produce a lot of seeds that can germinate very quickly. And so they're able to grow their populations really fast. I'll take the next slide. And so because of all these characteristics that I just mentioned, invasive species are a really big threat to local biodiversity. They can come in, they can outcompete native species, and cause a number of different specific impacts that we'll talk about a bit later when we talk about the specific species. And so because the BTC is working to conserve and steward this ribbon of wilderness along the Niagara Escarpment, a lot of our work does revolve around managing invasive species because we want to make sure that our ribbon of wilderness is biodiverse and that it's healthy. So next slide, and I think I'll pass it over to Lyndsey.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I'm going to do a very, very whirlwind review of what we call the main offenders. So last week, some of you may have noticed that it was Invasive Species Week. So a lot of these species you may have seen through other webinars, through social media posts, or through your own past knowledge. So we wanted to cover these very briefly so that you're aware of them. And if you're looking back on the slides, the information is still there for you to see and to use, but we don't want to cover these in too much detail so that we can cover a few other things we're starting to see on the trail here. So just to note these four here, we've got some giant hogweed, European buckthorn, garlic mustard, and dog strangling vine. So join me as we do our whirlwind tour. So here we've got garlic mustard, and the main thing to note about garlic mustard is each plant produces thousands of seeds. And the first year and the second year plant look very different from each other. So in the bottom left, you can actually see what a first year plant looks like, and it's low to the ground with kidney shaped leaves. And in the upper right, you can see a second year plant, and it's got much more of a height to it, up to 1 meter tall, and you can start to see those seed pods that are forming. So some of the impacts of garlic mustard is that the roots actually contain a chemical which can alter the ground chemistry and prevent other plants from growing. So if you've ever been on a hike through Dundas Valley in Hamilton, you can actually see where the garlic mustard has just taken over and created a carpet across the floor of garlic mustard, and it completely outtakes any other plant. For control, the biggest thing to note here is that it's going to take a minimum of 2 to 5 years to stay on top of depleting the seed bank. The seeds can stay viable for up to 5 years. So you can use different ways. You can pull out the plants, you can cut off the tops when they're flowering, or you can cover it with a tarp. That's my personal preference for my own backyard where I've had it. But 2 to 5 years is the minimum that it's going to take to stay on top of that to make sure that we're not seeing that come back. So next up, we've got our dog strangling vine, and it is in the milkweed family, which is going to be really important, but it is invasive. So for the dog strangling vine, you'll notice here that the seed pods actually look a lot like our native milkweed plants. And that's actually really detrimental to our monarch butterfly, which is what we're going to discuss in the impacts here, is that when a monarch butterfly is searching for a place to lay its eggs, the dog strangling vine looks very similar to the native milkweed. So the monarch lays its eggs on a dog strangling vine plant. And unfortunately, when the eggs hatch, there is no nutrients available for those larvae, so they don't survive. And you can see here in this photo, we've got a complete understory of dog strangling vine that has outcompeted everything else. So for control, very similar to our garlic mustard, you can actually hand pull the loose plants, lots and lots of seeds to this one as well. So again, a couple of years worth of monitoring in your area. You can also mow them, mow the seed heads off, and there is the possibility for an herbicide application by a licensed professional, which the BTC is able to do. This is my personal fan favorite because I deal with it in my own backyard, European buckthorn. And it is a very aggressive plant. Again, thousands of seeds to it. You can see the black seeds on the black berries on the tree there. And my biggest thing that I notice when I'm IDing a buckthorn out on a hike is the bright green leaves that tend to come out first thing in the spring before any other plant, and they stick around late in the fall also, again, like any other plant. And the second one in the top right, you'll see that just underneath the bark, there's an orange inner bark. And if you take a little pocket knife or your fiskars and give the bark a little slice, you'll actually be able to see that. And the lenticels on the outside are a little indicator as well. And the buckthorn impacts, because the leaves stay green throughout the season a lot longer than any other plant, they're actually able to photosynthesize longer. So that means it gives them a longer lifespan and allows them to outshade and outcompete the other native understory. They can also, pardon me, they can also increase the nitrogen in the soil that prevents other species from growing. And one of the things I always found super interesting about buckthorn is their seeds have a laxative effect on birds. So when wildlife eats it, they actually produce scat within a very few minutes afterwards, which helps to spread the seeds along. So it's really not helpful for the birds or wildlife to be eating that because they're not gaining any nutrients before the excrement comes out. The control for buckthorn is a nice fun one for our pull parties for our corporate events, which we'll touch on a little bit later. So small buckthorn can actually be hand pulled. In the photo there, you'll see someone using a hand pull tool, and we can actually use what we call an extractigator to pull out the buckthorn, and then we'll shake off the root ball and hang the roots from the trees in the local area. So if you're ever on a hike and you see a dead tree hung up by, top or bottom end up, that's actually probably the result of a BTC work party that's been through. And we're going to cover giant hogweed. We don't see this a lot on the trail, but it is one certainly to take note of. And the biggest thing here is you can see the height. So we've got a lovely gentleman posing beside one. And personally, I don't think I'd be getting that close to a giant hogweed. But some of the other ID features, besides its height, you can see the very bristly purple colored stem. And this plant is phototoxic. So if you touch it and you're exposed to sunlight, you can actually develop terrible burns from it. So this is something that we highly recommend staying away from. If you see this in the field, take a photo, submit to iNaturalist, and do your best to keep your distance from it. You can see here the impacts with the arm on the lower right hand corner there. So that's the result, probably a couple of days of the burn. So you can actually develop really horrible blisters from it. And it does produce thousands of seeds as well. So definitely one to keep an eye out for, but certainly not very prevalent on the trail just yet. And this is one for control that is best left to the professionals. So make sure that if you see this, you're cordoning off the area and allow somebody else to come in and professionally treat this. And they're going to come in with full protective gear to make sure that they're not coming in contact with it. They're going to bag it up, put it in a black garbage bag, and keep that in the sun to break down the plant material. So that was our whirlwind tour, and some giant hogweed lookalikes that you can see here is we've got some cow parsnip, wild parsnip, angelica, and Queen Anne's lace, and none of these come anywhere close to the height of a giant hogweed. So that is the big thing to note. But all of these do have a similar look, but keep your eyes out that these are all, a meter tall or less, and giant hogweed is multiple feet high. Mara, I'm going to put it off to you after that very quick review.
Okay, thanks, Lyndsey. So now we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about some species that you maybe don't hear about as often, but that you can certainly see along the Bruce Trail. So those other ones were ones that you might hear about a lot, but we wanted to make sure we tell you about some other species to keep an eye on. And so the first are invasive honeysuckles, and there's actually several species of invasive honeysuckle in Ontario. They're a shrub, and they're actually fairly common, particularly along the southern sections of the Bruce Trail of the Niagara Escarpment. So definitely one to keep an eye out for because they can spread quite rapidly. These were actually intentionally introduced to North America from Europe and Asia in the 1800s because they're often used as garden plants. They're quite pretty. They have very bright berries, as you can see in the photo here, and also quite bright, showy flowers. So people do like to grow them in their gardens. And they were also used and planted to prevent soil erosion because they can quickly form these really dense thickets. And they can do this in forest understories as well as open areas. So unfortunately, though, this plant does not stay in the garden or where it was planted, and it tends to spread into our natural areas and cause some problems. I'll take the next slide, Lyndsey. So in terms of identifying invasive honeysuckle, the first thing to note is that it is a multi-stemmed shrub. It's about 5 to 8 feet high. And so you have multiple stems branching from one point near the ground. And so it creates this very bushy look. It also has light brown bark that tends to sort of come off in these vertical strips. So that's something that you can look for. And then if you have a look at the photo on the right, you can see what the leaves and the flowers look like. So the leaves emerge from the twigs in pairs opposite to each other. And you can see that they have these really nice smooth edges. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And then they produce these really showy white or pink or sometimes red flowers. And the flowers, as well as the fruit, tend to emerge in pairs or in multiples of 2. So you can see in this photo, the flower buds for the flowers that haven't opened yet, they're coming out in little pairs. So that's another kind of feature to watch for. And then those flowers will produce bright red or orange berries like the ones that you saw in the previous slide, again in multiples of 2. And the other thing I wanted to note in terms of identification is that we actually do have a few native honeysuckle species as well in Ontario that can share some of these characteristics. So one thing that distinguishes them is that the invasive honeysuckle species tend to have hollow stems. So if you see where a twig has broken off or you take a little clipping, you'll be able to see that inside there's actually a hole through the middle of the stem of the invasive honeysuckle species. Whereas our native species tend to be solid all the way through. There will be tissue inside the twig. Next slide. So the impacts of honeysuckle are similar to a lot of the plants that we've talked about. They tend to really take over an area and outcompete native plants. They form these dense thickets. You can see how bushy just a single plant is there. So it shades out our native plants. It makes it really difficult also for young trees to kind of break out from the ground layer up into the canopy. So it can really start to affect the structure of the forest. The berries, kind of similar to buckthorn, are eaten by birds, but are not particularly nutritious for them. And so birds are eating these, but not really getting too much out of them. And there's also been some interesting studies showing that robins and wood thrushes that nest in invasive honeysuckles have reduced nesting success. And they think this is because honeysuckle shrubs are a bit lower to the ground. And so those nests might be subject to more predation than if there were native species growing there that the birds could nest in a little bit higher up from the ground. Next slide. So in terms of control, a honeysuckle can be managed in a similar way to invasive shrubs like buckthorn. So you can see another picture at the bottom here of an extractigator being used by a volunteer. So they can be pulled out by hand or with one of these wrench tools. And then larger plants that can't be pulled out can be cut, or they can be girdled, which is basically when we scrape off the bark and the inner living tissue all the way around the trunk. However, if you just cut and leave it, the plant will resprout from the base. And so often if we are going to cut or girdle honeysuckle, we do apply an herbicide afterwards to prevent resprouting. And again, that does need to be done by a licensed applicator. Another option that people can try, if for example, herbicide is not an option for them, is repeated mowing of small individuals or clipping. So this can be effective, but it does require repeated efforts over several years, which you can see is a bit of a common theme with a lot of these invasive plants. Next slide. So the second invasive plant that I wanted to highlight is called Japanese stiltgrass. And the reason we wanted to highlight this one is because it's a relatively new invader in Canada. It's only been recently recorded in a couple of places in Ontario in the last couple of years. So it was actually introduced to North America as packing material from Asia in the early 1900s, but it's only recently crossed the border into Canada. And this map from iNaturalist is showing observations of Japanese stiltgrass, and you can see it's quite a bit more common further south of us in the US. So this is one that we really want to try to stay on top of, because early on in the invasion is when we have the best chance of management and success, because it hasn't already spread everywhere and become really abundant. So this is certainly one to watch for on the trail. And if you see it, we really want to know about it. And in terms of where it is along the Bruce Trail at the moment, it has been detected in Short Hills Provincial Park, which is in the Niagara section of the trail. So that's where we're particularly keeping an eye on it. It likes shady, moist places, so you can look for it in moist forests, ditches, along trails, and along stream edges as well. Next slide. So to identify this, it is a grass. It's not a particularly tall growing grass. It tends to sort of sprawl over the ground and form these kind of mats. Some people say it looks kind of like a small bamboo. But the really key ID feature is if you take a look at the photo on the right here, the leaves, which are about 7 centimeters long, they have this really silvery looking stripe down the middle of the leaf. So it's actually the vein that goes down the middle of the leaf has these little silvery hairs on it, and it creates this striped look. And so that can help distinguish it from some other grasses that might look similar. It also turns this kind of purpley brown color in the fall. So that's something to watch for if you're hiking later in the year. And then because it's a grass, like most other grasses, it doesn't have big showy flowers. It just produces these greenish looking little flower spikes that you can see on the bottom left. Next slide. So in terms of the impacts, I probably sound like a broken record because the main one is that it's outcompeting native species and forming this really dense monoculture of just this one invasive species. And you can see that on the photo on the right, that that entire ground cover has been taken over by the Japanese stiltgrass. It can also release chemicals that prevent native seed germinations, that's giving it that extra edge. And when we lose the native species that would normally be growing along the ground, like our spring ephemerals and wildflowers, we're losing habitat and food sources for wildlife. So a lot of our early flowering wildflowers are super important for all of the pollinators and insects that come out early in the season and are hungry and looking for food to eat and to provision their nests with. And so when Japanese stiltgrass takes over, they're losing those food sources. And so that's the big impact there. Next slide. So in terms of control for the stiltgrass, hand pulling can be effective. It's not particularly deep rooted, so it can be pulled out. This is best for small populations because it is pretty labor intensive. It has been shown that it can be mowed as well, and this is best done right when the plants are flowering so that you get them before they set seed, so you're preventing the spread. Some work out of the US has also shown that they've experimented with applying a thick layer of mulch over an area before the stiltgrass emerges in the spring, and it basically just kind of prevents it from emerging. And then they can actually reseed that decomposing mulch with some native species. So that has been tried out and been successful in a couple of instances. And then finally, there is an herbicide option for those larger populations where manual methods are just maybe not practical. Again, needing to be done by a licensed professional. Next slide.
Okay, so we're going to switch over a little bit, and normally the main offenders that we talk about are very plant oriented, but we wanted to talk about some pests that we're starting to see along the trail, and a very big one right now is the emerald ash borer. And it was first detected in Ontario in 2002, and it feeds on all species of ash trees, which we have several native ones. And once a tree is infected, it's actually nearly a 100% mortality rate. And it has killed millions and millions of trees in Ontario already. And the range is slowly expanding because it has no known natural enemies. So for IDing the emerald ash borer, I personally have never seen the actual beetle, but I do have ash trees in my backyard, and I've seen the tree ID parts of it. So to ID the emerald ash borer, they've got a very metallic green beetle and then a very long creamy white pupa. So what you're going to see typically, though, is the evidence on the trees. And here you can see where the bark has actually peeled away on the tree, and you can actually see where the larva has wormed its way underneath and essentially has girdled the tree and prevented the nutrients from reaching the top. And you'll also see there's 3 distinct D-shaped exit holes on that bark. And that's the evidence of the larva exiting and heading up into the trees to actually be able to continue their life cycle. And some of the other evidence that you'll see is the crown dieback on these large trees and bark deformities as the larvae take hold underneath. So some of the impacts here, major impact on economics and environmentals, because in some places the tree canopy has been altered by up to 25%. And this can open up the canopy space for other invasive species like buckthorn. So I wanted to highlight here that there's 2 photos here, and I'm not sure how well you can see them, but the top one is a photo or a screen grab off of Google Maps just by Sherman Falls. And what you're looking at here, every one of these brown trees is actually a dead ash tree. And this was my, oh my goodness moment. I was doing some work. The Bruce Trail actually runs through here. You can see that little dotted line is the Bruce Trail. And I was doing some work for some landowners in the area, and I pulled up Google Maps. And I'm looking at the photo, I'm like, what time of year was this photo taken at that so many of these trees have already lost their leaves? And then it clued into me that, oh my goodness, pardon me, every one of these is a dead ash tree. And you can see it again on the lower photo. And this is also Bruce Trail just over here. And this is the Hermitage in Dundas Valley. And again, you can see the dead ash trees. So that's quite the impact that it's had on Southern Ontario, and almost every single conservation authority is currently working on mitigating the impacts. However, there isn't that much that we can actually do to control the emerald ash borer. It has a max flight range of 15 kilometers, which is far enough to be able to gain some distance, but its main method of travel is by people. And the main thing to do or to take note of is that you should not move firewood outside of a restricted area, which is also something good to know just in general, because you never know what you're moving with that firewood. But the trees can be protected with an injection from an insecticide, but it's a very labor-intensive process, and they really only are doing that for select few trees that are, say, a shade tree in an urban area that they're able to work one-on-one with that tree. But in general, we are unfortunately losing all of our ash trees in Southern Ontario to the emerald ash borer. So in the photo here, you can actually see we had a BTC work party, and a company came out to work on our Fisher's Pond property to remove some hazard trees. And this just gives you a scale of, how a small little beetle can take down an entire tree. That entire tree had to be felled because it does create an issue for our hikers that are going underneath. And we obviously don't want any of these large limbs falling on a hiker below. One thing that I found interesting is that the blue ash seems to have some resistance to the emerald ash borer, which is the same in its native country. but it's still losing the battle as a whole. The next invasive pest I wanted to cover is the spongy moth. And this spongy moth may be new to some people, but you might have formerly known it as the gypsy moth or LDD. So the name has officially been changed to spongy moth, representing the spongy egg masses that it lays on trees. And this past summer was a particularly hard hit year for the Bruce Trail, Southern Ontario, certain stands of trees. They tend to go after oaks, hardwoods, sometimes spruce. They do have their favorites, but if they're in an area, they are not picky on what tree they will take after. Here we've got a photo of an adult spongy moth, and on the left is a male and on the right is a female, and just underneath you can actually see the egg mass that they've got. So what the egg mass looks like the most to me is if you've ever put those felt pads on the bottom of furniture in your house, that's actually what it looks like and sort of what it feels like, and about the same size as well. And this is a bigger photo showing really the impact that the eggs can have on a tree. So you can see some of the eggs, and then also you can see some of the cocoons that have happened here where they've transferred over into the next stage of their life. And if a tree is infested, you can see this right at eye level. It's very easy to see. And the caterpillars are quite messy as well. So one of the things to ID on the caterpillars is they have 5 pairs of blue spots after their head, and then 6 pairs of red spots. And the actual caterpillars can be yellow, gray, or black with these wispy hairs, but the pattern that's always the same is those blue spots and the red spots. And if you've ever seen an infestation of the spongy moth caterpillars, they are intense, just, you know, every centimeter almost covered in these in the caterpillars. Something else that is really funny, but not funny when you understand what's happening, is when you're walking in an area, you can almost feel like you're being rained on by caterpillar scat if you've got a tree with a really heavy infestation, because as they're hanging out in the trees above you, they're dropping their excrement below, and you'll see almost like raindrops falling, or you can hear them falling on other leaves. The main impact of the spongy moth is in their caterpillar stage, because the caterpillars can actually eat through a square meter of canopy. Just on each caterpillar can eat through a square meter of canopy, and they can take out an entire tree within a matter of days. Now, defoliating a tree might not necessarily be an issue, but it can cause a dieback of twigs and branches, and it can make trees a little bit more vulnerable to other pests and diseases. And if this happens on a year-to-year basis, it can stress the tree out to and it actually increases the chances of mortality. Something else to note is that the direct contact with the caterpillars can actually produce a rash on your skin. So if you are seeing them, they're not something that you really want to be allowing the grandkids to play with in the backyard. So for the control aspect, unlike the caterpillars, the adult spongy moth as a moth doesn't actually eat. Its sole purpose is to mate and to create the next generation. So if you're already seeing it at the moth stage, there isn't much that you can do except for making sure that if it does lay eggs, you're removing the eggs. If you're going out camping, or you've got any patio furniture, your tent, firewood, if you're moving that from one site to another, make sure you're checking all of your gear for the caterpillars or the egg masses. And you want to take a credit card or a spatula and you want to scrape those off and dump them into a bucket of bleachy water or soapy water, or crush them underfoot. It is a very labor intensive process, but that is the best way for a small scale control of the spongy moth. Large scale, we're looking at aerial suppression, so using an airplane to actually dump a chemical out over an area that helps to protect the trees from the infestation. But that is a very costly thing, and we want to make sure that we're not targeting any other species if we're doing an aerial suppression. Laura?
Okay, so we've talked about some invasive plants, we've talked about invasive pests, and now I'm just going to highlight a couple of invasive pathogens or diseases that we're dealing with here in Southern Ontario. And the first one is called butternut canker. And this is a fungus that infects and kills butternut trees. So butternut, it's a nut tree, it's related to the black walnut, and you can see scattered trees pretty much all along the Niagara Escarpment here in Ontario. And so this is the tree that is the target for the butternut canker. So the canker was first detected around the 1960s in North America, and it now exists throughout the entire range of the butternut tree. And it produces these spores that can spread from tree to tree through raindrops and on birds and insects and seeds that might be moving around. And once it gets to a new tree, it can enter through little openings in the bark and also through the buds of the tree. And once it's in there, it can then spread throughout the inner tissues of the tree. Next slide. So the way that you can identify butternut canker, once you know what to look for, it's actually relatively easy to detect. And because what it does is it produces these cankers, which are basically these wounds on the trunk and the branches of the tree that are sort of sunken in spots that look sooty and black. So you can see that in the photo on the right, an example of what that kind of looks like. And that sooty black color is caused when in the spring, this black fluid kind of oozes out through cracks in the bark, and then it dries up and leaves those sooty patches on the tree. So that's what you're looking for. And then, of course, as the tree succumbs to the disease, it's going to start looking unhealthy. So you can look for dying and leafless branches in the canopy. You can look for sort of missing or peeling bark, particularly right around the cankers. And then you can also look for these small branches that might be starting to sprout out from the actual trunk of the tree near the base. And we call this epicormic growth. And it's basically a stress signal that the tree knows that it's not doing well, and it's trying to produce this new growth at the bottom as sort of a last ditch effort. So basically you're looking for cankers and then signs of unhealthiness. And the impact of the butternut canker on the butternut population has been huge. Similar to the work of the emerald ash borer, what this fungus does is it damages the vessels in the tree that are transporting water and nutrients throughout the tree. And so by damaging those, it basically strangles or starves the tree because it can't move nutrients around to different spots in the tree. And so it can pretty quickly kill a butternut tree of any age, even if it's otherwise healthy. And so as a result, the butternut, which exists throughout Eastern North America, you can see on the map on the right, this is observations of butternut. So you can see that it's quite a large area that we're talking about. And butternut is now listed as an endangered species in Canada because of this disease. And so losing butternut means a decrease in forest diversity as we lose these different canopy trees to various pests and diseases. And butternut's also an important food source for wildlife. So squirrels and things will eat the nuts. And so we're seeing a loss of food for wildlife as well. Next slide. So unfortunately, like some of these other pests, there's not really a good treatment or control for butternut canker at the moment. So our best bet is actually finding naturally resistant trees. So some trees appear to be less affected by the disease. They are able to survive. They don't show as many symptoms. And so this suggests that they might have some genetic resistance, or perhaps the environment that they're growing in is helping them to resist. And so right now, any trees that appear to be resistant are being studied, and their fruits are being collected to use as seed sources so that we can propagate more of these resistant trees and hopefully plant them back out on the landscape to keep the butternut population alive. And then the final species that we're going to highlight today is another fungal pathogen. It's called Dutch elm disease. You may have heard of it because it's been pretty widely talked about. And it affects a variety of elm species in Canada. You can see the photo on the right is a photo of an American elm leaf. And so the Dutch elm disease is native to Asia and Europe, and it was first detected in Eastern Canada in the 1940s. And by the 1970s and 80s, we were seeing wide-scale elm death because of this disease. And this fungus spreads a little differently than the butternut canker. It's actually mainly spread by elm bark beetles. So there's a few different species of beetles that bore into elm tree bark, and the fungus can sort of get attached to them, and then they transport it from tree to tree. And it can also actually spread via roots. So the if two trees are close together and one's infected and their roots underneath the ground are sort of grafted together, then the fungus can spread from one to the other. Next slide. So to identify the disease, you sort of need to know what elm trees look like. And so one way you can identify them is that they have these oval-shaped leaves that have very jagged edges, which you could see in the previous slide. So we often call them double-toothed because they have these larger jagged edges, and then on those teeth, they're even smaller little jagged edges. And then you're looking again for signs of stress on the tree. So infected trees might have wilting or yellowing leaves. They may drop their leaves earlier in the year than you might expect. And again, they might produce these small shoots coming right from the trunk of the tree near the base. That is a sign of stress. Another symptom of the disease is that if the bark has peeled off the branches, you'll see these brown streaks along the branches. That is basically a sign of the disease in the vessels of the tree. And then finally, you can look for signs of the bark beetles themselves. So the photo on the right here is a photo of a trunk of an elm tree where the bark has peeled off, and you can see all these little galleries that the beetle larvae have made in the tree, and it's quite a distinct pattern. Next slide. So again, there's been a huge impact of this disease on our elm population, and it works very similar to some of the other diseases we've talked about. It damages the vessels of the tree that are transporting water and nutrients throughout the tree, and without that, the tree dies very quickly. It particularly affects American elm and rock elm, and in fact, we've lost about 95% of our American elm population here. So there are very few mature American elm trees left because of this disease. And in addition to reducing forest diversity, it's actually had a big impact in urban areas because elm trees used to be widely planted as street trees. And so in many areas, like you can see in the before and after picture on the bottom, this is I think from Winnipeg, we went from having these beautiful shaded tree-lined streets to a very stark contrast once the disease moved through. So it's had an impact on natural and urban environments for sure. Next slide. So there is a fungicide that's available to treat Dutch elm disease, but similar to treatment for, say, the emerald ash borer, it's not really practical for large-scale use because it's very expensive and each individual tree would have to be treated repeatedly in order to protect it. So it's just really not practical for use in forests. Another thing that can be done to control the disease is if it's detected early, infected branches can be pruned off to prevent spread. But similar to the butternut canker, our best bet is actually finding and screening resistant trees. So there's an elm recovery project at the University of Guelph that's supported by the Gosling Research Institute for Plant Preservation, GRIP. And they have been propagating resistant varieties of elm. And we were actually able to plant some of these trees out in our nature reserves last year. And we're really excited to monitor them and hopefully see them thrive. Next slide.
All right, so we are going to do a little pop quiz here. Want to keep you guys on your toes, make sure everybody's paying attention here. So our first question that we're going to do is this fun little guy here, and this is a spongy moth. And what I'd like to know, if we can pop up the question bar there, is this a male spongy moth or a female spongy moth? So if you can use the poll question to answer, and we'll give you guys a moment to do that.
The votes are coming in, Lyndsey. We'll know shortly. Give it another few seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and then do you want me to share the results?
Yes, please. Thank you, Jackie. All right, so we do have a male spongy moth here, and this was a little bit harder to see because you're looking at him head on instead of at his wingspan. But if you actually do look at the wings, you can see more of that brown color versus the white color of the female spongy moth. So the next question that we have is this here. Are we looking at dog strangling vine, or are we looking at Japanese stiltgrass?
Okay, again, we'll give a few seconds for everybody to answer. Okay, just a couple seconds more. All right, I'm going to end the poll, and I will share the results.
Very good to see. So this is indeed Japanese stiltgrass, and one of the main ways that you can ID this is by that telltale silver line that is heading down the middle of the leaf there. And dog strangling vine tends to be a little bit more of a vine, as the name implies, whereas this is a grass and grows a little bit lower to the ground. Next up, we have the question here, are we looking at wild parsnip, or are we looking at giant hogweed?
Votes are coming in, or the poll questions. Poll responses, we'll give it a few more seconds here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and I will share the results.
Wild parsnip. All right, so now funny enough, this is actually a trick question here. So what we're looking at here is Queen Anne's lace, a farm field favorite along the Bruce Trail. So the giant hogweed, without any scale to notice, is a little bit harder to ID from Queen Anne's lace. But if you compare these photos side by side of a person standing next to the giant hogweed, you can really see the height difference between the giant hogweed on the right and the Queen Anne's lace on the left. And when you see this many umbrals, like the flower canopy, so close together, it's probably most likely Queen Anne's lace. And if you had any scale for the photo, you'd see that this is less than 1 meter tall. So definitely not giant hogweed. So I want to thank you for participating in our pop quiz today, and hopefully it keeps your ID skills a little bit more on top of noticing small little differences between some of these invasive species. Mara?
Thanks, Lyndsey. So now that we've kind of gone through a lot of the common invasive species we can see along the trail, we can see that there's a lot of different invasive species that we're dealing with. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing about invasive species here at the BTC. And I'm going to talk about each of these points in more detail. So I'll have you actually go to the next slide, Lyndsey. So the first thing is that we actually have an invasive species strategy here at the BTC that helps us prioritize management of different species in different areas. And so we really place high priority on the health and safety of trail users and volunteers. which is why things like giant hogweed, which you can see on the bottom right again, are really high priorities for us because they pose that health and safety risk. And then once health and safety is taken care of, we're really focusing on making sure that areas with rare and sensitive species or ecosystems and areas with high native biodiversity that haven't already been invaded are kept in good shape. And so we definitely focus on those areas. And we also focus our efforts along pathways of spread because we want to reduce further spread as much as possible. So the trail is sometimes a pathway for spread as seeds can cling to hikers as they walk by. So we do try to focus our efforts there as well. And this is something you can think about if you're managing invasive species in your own yard or on your own property, is thinking about starting with those early invasions where you have the best chance of being able to get in there and manage them quickly, and sort of working from low concentration of invasive species towards areas of higher concentration. Next slide. We also are trying to get as much of a handle as possible on where different invasive species are, particularly in our nature reserves. So several years ago, we started a mapping project where volunteers and staff would go out and assess the abundance of different invasive species in a grid pattern on our property. So this is a map that was produced from that work, where the sort of reddish color is high abundance. And then as we move to green, we're getting lower abundance of, in this case, buckthorn. And we also maintain an iNaturalist project, which we'll provide a link to later, where anyone can report observations of species, including invasive species, along the Bruce Trail. That gives us a better sense of where we need to focus our efforts. Next slide. The third thing that you may have noticed, depending on where you've been hiking along the trail, is that we've been installing boot brush stations at particular access points along the trail. And you can see a picture of one on the right here. It's basically a little bed where we have some gravel, and then we have a brush where you can brush off your boots before and after your hike. And so this ensures that any seeds that have stuck to the mud on your boots are getting contained in one area and they're not spreading into the area, or they're not spreading out of an area if you go hike somewhere else later that day. And a lot of the trail etiquette and trail users code also helps to prevent invasive species spread, because things like staying on the trail, leaving plants where you found them, is all preventing spread of plant materials and seeds from one place to another. Next slide. And then finally, we do a lot of boots on the ground invasive species removal and management work. And a lot of this is spearheaded by each Bruce Trail Club and by volunteers, which is really amazing. So we host pull parties where a group of volunteers will get together and go out to one of our nature reserves and pull garlic mustard, or use the weed wrenches to pull out some buckthorn. And we get a lot of help from partner organizations and partner corporate groups and companies as well, which is really awesome. And we also, as a staff, implement larger restoration projects that involve both invasive species management and then other activities like replanting of native species. And then I'm going to pass it over to Lyndsey to talk about one of our other programs that we have.
So this is a relatively new program that we are just entering into our third season with now, and it's called the Landowner Stewardship Program. And this is available to landowners who own property where the Bruce Trail crosses their property. It's a voluntary thing, and it is of no cost to the landowner. And the purpose is to help support the private landowners who want to help to maintain the unique environmental values of their property, like wildlife habitat, sensitive natural areas, any native or rare species that they're seeing on their property. And the BTC staff and volunteers are there to provide guidance and financial support to assist with planning and implementing these habitat and restoration projects. So some of the things that we've done in the past here, you can see some of our landowners up. These are near in Waterdown. And what we've done here is helped these two landowners to plant some native species to help close in this area of trail that is currently not in use, but we are hoping to be able to use at a later point in time. We also help these same landowners to remove some of the invasive buckthorn and Norway maple that was in their backyard area. And this is a project that we hope to continue in the future. So if you are a landowner along the Bruce Trail, please feel free to get in touch with me to get a little bit more information about our landowner stewardship program and what the BTC can do to help you out with that. So this is another just a quick go over of some of the before and after of the work that we do. So you can actually see here, we've got volunteers out manually doing a hand pull, and you can see the before on where they're still working and the after. And as Mara and I have both mentioned several times over, invasive species are aggressive, and they just have no end in sight. They energize their bunnies, so they just keep going and going. And it can take a lot of effort to work through these, but the more that we are all on top of participating in these stewardship projects, the easier it is to maintain things along the trail. Mara?
Thanks, Lyndsey. And we're pretty much wrapping up here. I'm aware of our time, so I don't want to belabor this too much, but I just wanted to talk about, if this is something that you're interested in, a few options that you have. And one is that I think we've already mentioned is that there's this great website and an app called iNaturalist where you can report sightings of all kinds of species, including invasive species, and we'll provide a link to that after. So I encourage you to get on there. You can kind of it helps you learn how to identify species as well. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. You can certainly become a volunteer and keep an eye out for any pull parties that may be going on near you. These are things that the BTC and Bruce Trail clubs host, and also many other organizations like conservation authorities host events like this. So definitely a way to get involved. You can learn to sort of identify and manage invasive species on your own property. And we're going to put some links to other resources at the end here to give you more information if that's something you're interested in doing. And then the rest are just these sort of trail etiquette tips that we've talked about a little bit, things like staying on the trail, making sure you're cleaning off your equipment, not moving firewood. These are all ways that you can prevent invasive species from spreading around. And this last point at the bottom, I just wanted to mention, because unfortunately, some nurseries and garden centers still sell invasive species that you can plant in your garden. And so I really encourage you to do a bit of research before you buy plants. Maybe ask the garden center things like, where does this grow naturally? Where does this come from? Make sure you get the name of the species so you can do a bit of research so that you make sure you're not accidentally bringing these home with you. Next slide. So this is just a link to some of the resources that we recommend, and we will actually put links. I think Megan's going to throw them in the chat, or they'll also be in our video description when we post this on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you, there's lots of information out there. So please go take a look. Next slide. And with that, I think we have time for a few questions. So I think I'll pass it back to Michael.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Lyndsey. We all learned a lot. So, and there actually are quite a few questions. So I'll try and read them quickly. The first one is, I'm a land steward in the Peninsula Club. I thought I'd found giant hogweed on a township road leading to one of our properties. The only difference was that this stuff was only 5 to 6 inches high. My land steward told me this was a common weed in the peninsula and not giant hogweed. Any comments?
Yeah, so I think as Lyndsey covered, there's actually quite a few things that can kind of look like giant hogweed. So you may be looking at Queen Anne's lace, or if it's a little bit bigger, maybe cow parsnip. So you can definitely take a look into some of those other species and see if maybe that's what you have.
Okay, thank you. The next question, if we are aware of some invasive species on Bruce Trail owned properties, how would we let someone know?
I think probably our iNaturalist project is the best way to do that. And we actually have a couple of videos on our YouTube channel about that project and how to get involved with it. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And it's a great quick way you can just take a picture and report it. And we keep an eye on what's coming in on our side so that we know about them.
Okay, thank you. Question, how much is climate change influencing the promotion of invasive species?
Lyndsey, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
So climate change is an interesting one because we're starting to see a lot more species that are more southern species heading further north. And the Bruce Trail can act, as Mara mentioned, as a corridor for some of those invasive species. So as things are migrating north, we can help to further that spread for both native and non-native and invasive species. This great corridor that we have, provides this ribbon of wilderness, but we aren't seeing a lot in regards to climate change just yet, but it is something that we are aware of. And as we go forward, we are more aware of what we're purchasing to plant on the trail, to keep things within their range, but also maybe extending them a little bit more. And then also noting that things like the emerald ash borer, it was assumed that they wouldn't be able to survive our cold winters, but that's not actually the case. They can survive well into temperatures of minus 35 degrees Celsius. So it's something that the Bruce Trail definitely has an eye on at this time.
Okay, thank you. Question, what is the best way to deal with wild chervil?
That's a tricky one, and we do have that particularly in some of the northern sections of the trail. So wild chervil can be mowed repeatedly to prevent it from setting seed. So if you have the ability to come back a few times throughout the season, I would recommend the mowing option. If you have a smaller population, it can be hand pulled, but you really have to get the root. So you want to do it when the soil is moist. For larger populations, there is the herbicide option, and in some cases where those manual methods aren't possible, we have explored the herbicide option as well.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Why is it called dog strangling vine, and does it strangle dogs?
I'll take this one, Mara. So dog strangling vine just got its name because it's once it creates a space for itself, it almost sets out like a net. So it doesn't actually strangle dogs, but it does create a net-like structure as the vines twist among each other and then grow off to different trees. So it can almost look like a bird banding net if you come across it, and it's got access to different trees. Doesn't actually strangle dogs, no harm to dogs. Greatest harm is to our forest floor and our monarch butterflies and other insects that rely on our milkweed plants, our native milkweed plants for their larvae.
Okay, great. There's a couple questions here that thematically ask the same thing, and that's, what do you do with the invasives once you pull them? How do you dispose of them properly?
Yeah, this is a great question. It depends a little bit on what invasive species you have, but particularly for invasive species, where you're pulling them and they already have the beginnings of flowers or seeds, these cannot be composted because the seeds can then spread through the compost. It doesn't necessarily kill them. So if you're pulling out parts where there's flowers or seeds, they do generally, what you can do is leave them in a black plastic garbage bag out in the sun for a few weeks to try to kind of kill them. We call it solarizing them as much as possible. And then those do need to be disposed of in the landfill. For some other plants, like say buckthorn, if it doesn't have berries on it and you're pulling the shrub, as long as you get the soil off the roots and you place it in a way that the roots cannot make it back to the ground, so that's why we hang them upside down, those can be left in place.
Okay, great. Here's a question. What branch of weed wrench does the BTC use?
We use the sort of extractigator is sort of the actual product name. So that's what we use. You can purchase them online, but I think anything along those lines will work.
Okay. Here's a question. Does wild parsnip also cause a photosensitive rash?
It does, and actually really anything in that family. So carrot, parsnip, it has a tendency that when the plant gets wet, especially, you can actually have that reaction. I know personally in my own backyard, I grow both carrots and parsnips, and I've had that reaction having been out in the garden pulling weeds after a rain event. And I was not aware that my carrots and my parsnip tops could actually do that. But yes, that entire family can create that photosynthetic issue.
Okay, great. And we've got hikers on this webinar, of course, and so there's a great question here. If you see garlic mustard or dog strangling vine on the trail, do you suggest hikers pick it?
I think this is kind of a tough one because the trail crosses property that we manage, but it also crosses private property. And so we do want to be mindful of not sort of overstepping on private property. So I would kind of recommend reporting it on iNaturalist or contacting us, because then we can, if it's a private property, Lyndsey can contact the landowner and see if they're interested in managing it throughout the property. And if it's one of our properties, then we can organize a pull party and get a bunch of people together to pull it. Probably as you're walking by, particularly if it's pretty abundant, you're probably not going to be able to get enough of it just walking by. So I think I would say the best thing to do is sort of make sure that we're aware of it, so then we can get the necessary people together to really make an impact.
One of the other things to note on that is that you also want to be aware that if you're straying off the trail to pull an invasive species, there are other native species that you may be trampling in that process, things that might not have come up yet in the spring, or other sensitive areas that we don't want to be destroying, say salamander habitat. And we don't want to be pulling the wrong species as we go. So definitely report it. And if you're local to that area and you want to create like a volunteer event, feel free to get in touch with our volunteer coordinator, Megan, and we can possibly set up a volunteer pull party to get everybody in the community involved.
Okay, great. There's still about 10 more questions, so we'll try and pick some ones that we haven't touched on. Can you speak to the unintended consequences of acting on an invasive species solo?
Sure, yeah. I think hopefully what this question I think is getting at is that sometimes if we're dealing with an invasive species in a disturbed area, one potential consequence of removing that invasive species is that another invasive species moves in, and it could be more harmful than the first one that we removed. So that's definitely something that we're mindful of. And one of the ways that we mitigate that is ideally by doing some restoration of the area afterwards. So if it's an area where we're removing a lot of invasive species and there's not maybe a lot of native species ready to fill in, then we often do replanting or mulching of the area to try to prevent establishment of other invasive species. The other thing that we sometimes hear concerns about is the herbicide use. Not everyone is sort of on board with the chemical control of invasive species, and I can completely understand that. There can be side effects, and so really what it comes down to for us is weighing the costs and benefits of not removing an invasive species versus sometimes removing it with an herbicide. So it's something that we take very seriously, and we use all of the different tools in our toolbox as effectively as we can.
Okay, thank you. And we'll maybe do 2 more questions. Has the hypena moth been approved in Ontario for the control of dog strangling vine?
That is a great question. I do not know the answer. So there are quite a few sort of biocontrol research programs going on for various invasive species. I'm not actually sure specifically what stage that one is at.
Okay. And then final question, if you remove an invasive plant, is it advisable to seed a native plant in its place?
For sure, I'll let Lyndsey expand on that.
Yeah, so part of our restoration process is that if we are taking something out, as Mara mentioned, that we really try to be present as soon as possible to plant something in its place, plant something native, or to put the ground cover so that it doesn't appear as disturbed. Because something, say, if you take a buckthorn out, the roots do create quite a disturbance in the soil. And now you have raw soil that other seeds have access to start to germinate on that top. But if you plant something else in its place that's already somewhat established, or you overseed it with a native seed blend, then those are more likely to outcompete anything that's invasive coming through, because we have the intent or the size, and we're going in with a bigger mass to outcompete that.
Yeah, and I think the only maybe exception to that is if we know that there's quite a native seed source nearby, and depending on the time of year, we might wait and see if native species come up. It kind of depends on the situation, but I think in general, that's been our approach.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Lyndsey and Mara, for an amazing presentation and answering all the great questions. It's clear that BDC is doing really important work in helping to protect the ecology of the Niagara Escarpment. So thanks for all you're doing. And thanks to all of you volunteers who are out there helping us do this as well. And so thanks for joining us. And I think that's it.
Yeah, feel free if there are any questions, any follow-up questions, feel free to email either myself or Mara, and we'd be happy to help you out. And if you are seeing any invasive species along Bruce Trail owned property, feel free to connect with Mara. And if you'd like to do any restoration work on private landowner spaces along the Bruce Trail, please feel free to connect with me. But thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you learned something from our webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.